My parents kicked me out in 10th grade pregnant. 25 years later, they sued me for my son. The night I got the call that would unravel 25 years of silence, I was folding laundry at the kitchen table, humming quietly while my son, now a grown man, sat in the living room, laughing at some late-night comedy. The phone buzzed, and the number on the screen froze me. It was a law firm. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're representing your parents," the voice said, flat and rehearsed. "They've filed a petition regarding custody of your son." My hands went cold, the fabric slipping through my fingers as if gravity had suddenly grown heavier. For a moment, I thought I misheard. Custody? Of my son? The boy they abandoned me with when I was still a child myself. The same boy they refused to buy diapers for when I begged them at 16, swollen and desperate? It felt like someone had reached back through time, back to that night in 10th grade when my father stood at the foot of my bed and told me to pack my things. "We don't raise mistakes," he'd said, his voice cutting sharper than the winter wind outside. My mother had been silent, arms folded, eyes like stone. I had left with nothing but a half-filled backpack and a body carrying a life I didn't even understand yet. And now, a quarter of a century later, they dared to come back, not with apologies, not with remorse, but with lawyers. The irony clawed at me so violently I could barely breathe. I looked over at my son, his head thrown back in laughter, completely unaware that the people who once condemned his existence were now trying to claim him. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. The story I thought was finished was only beginning again. When I close my eyes, I can still feel the sting of that first winter on my own. 16 years old, belly swollen under my oversized hoodie, shivering in a shelter cot because no friend's family wanted to deal with the scandal of a pregnant teenager. My parents hadn't just kicked me out, they erased me. At school, teachers whispered. Neighbors crossed the street. Church friends pretended they didn't know me. And yet, in all that abandonment, the baby inside me became my only anchor. I worked nights cleaning offices, mopping floors with my feet aching, nausea still pulling at my throat. I learned to sleep in 2-hour shifts, with one arm always around the bundle in the crib, because I had no one else to watch him. I can't tell you how many times I stared at a single can of formula, trying to make it last an extra day by adding more water, because I had to choose between food for myself or milk for him. Meanwhile, my parents sent Christmas cards to extended relatives bragging about their 2 perfect children, my younger brother and sister, without ever mentioning me. They hosted dinner parties, decorated their house like a magazine spread, and when people asked about me, they'd shrug, say, "She made choices." It was their mantra. She made choices. As if a child, abandoned by her own family, pregnant and scared, could ever truly choose anything. I fought tooth and nail to survive. GED at 18, community college by 20, working 2 jobs while raising a toddler. Every accomplishment came with scars, but they were mine, not theirs. I remember my son's first day of kindergarten. He held my hand so tightly and whispered, "Don't leave me, Mommy." And I promised him, in that moment, I would never do what had been done to me. I would never let him feel disposable. When I watched him step onto that yellow bus, backpack almost bigger than him, I knew that every night of hunger, every tear in the dark, every humiliation I endured had been worth it. And now, decades later, those same people, the ones who wouldn't buy a single pack of diapers, who wouldn't look me in the eye at my lowest, were trying to drag me into court and tell me they deserved rights to the man my son had become. The papers they filed painted me as unfit, called me a bad influence, accused me of poisoning him against them. But what poisoned him? Their absence, their silence, their decision to leave me in the snow with nowhere to go. The audacity burned in me like wildfire. I stayed up the entire night after that call, staring at old photographs and documents, pulling out shoeboxes of receipts, report cards, medical bills, all the evidence of a life I had built from nothing. And I whispered to myself over and over, "You wanted nothing to do with him when he was helpless. You don't get to claim him now that he's strong." That was the moment I decided. If they wanted a war, they would get one. But this time, I wasn't a scared girl with a backpack. I was a grown woman, with proof, with witnesses, with a son who knew the truth better than anyone. I didn't just think back to the shelter nights and the watered-down formula. I thought about the years in between, every single milestone they weren't there for. The birthday cakes baked from boxed mix when I couldn't afford anything else, my son blowing out candles with frosting smeared across his cheeks while I held back tears of exhaustion. The parent-teacher conferences where teachers leaned across little desks and told me, "He's bright, but he needs more support at home." And I swallowed the lump in my throat because I was the only support at home. The way I drove a car with the muffler tied up by a coat hanger, just so I could get him to soccer practice, praying it wouldn't fall off before we made it to the field. They weren't there when he was in the hospital at 8 years old, fever spiking so high I thought I'd lose him, and I had to sign every document alone while the doctor asked where his grandparents were. They weren't there when he graduated high school with honors, when I screamed myself hoarse in the bleachers, clutching a bouquet I could barely afford, because I had raised him from nothing to that very moment. And yet now they dared to twist words into legal filings, to act like I was some villain who turned him against family. No, they turned against family when they locked the door behind me at 16 and told me I was no longer their daughter. What they wanted wasn't love. It was control. And they had lost that control a long time ago. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, spreading out the paperwork under the dim yellow light, and a strange calm settled over me. Because this wasn't just about custody. This was about history. It was about the record finally being set straight. For years, I let their silence tell the story, their excuses fill the air. She made choices, she fell in with the wrong crowd, she didn't want our help. But now, in court, the truth would come with dates, with receipts, with witnesses. I had kept everything. The eviction notice they forced on me, the employment letters showing I worked double shifts, the hospital bills with my name alone, the handwritten notes from teachers praising how involved I was as a mother. My son walked into the kitchen that night, yawning, and saw the mountain of papers in front of me. He sat down across the table, eyes narrowing. "What's all this?" he asked. I hesitated, then slid the letter across to him, the one from the law firm. He read it in silence, jaw tightening, hands gripping the page until his knuckles turned white. Finally, he looked up at me and there was no fear in his eyes. Only anger. Only loyalty. "They're not going to win, Mom," he said, his voice steady. "They weren't there for us. They can't just show up now." And when he said us, I felt something shatter inside me. For 25 years, I had carried the weight of being mother and father, protector and provider. And here was my son, grown, standing with me. Not against me, with me. That was when I knew this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was ours. The first court date was set for a Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. sharp, the kind of gray November day where the clouds hang so low they feel like they're pressing on your chest. I walked into that courthouse with my son beside me, his broad shoulders a reminder of how far we'd come. He wore the suit I bought him for job interviews, navy blue, the tie slightly crooked, and I fixed it before we stepped inside. For a moment, I flashed back to him as a boy, reaching for my hand at crosswalks. And now here he was, a man, walking with me into battle. My parents were already there, sitting stiff-backed at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, a man with silver hair and a voice that dripped with fake politeness. My mother wore pearls, the same kind she used to polish at the dinner table while telling me to sit up straighter. My father's jaw was set, his eyes sliding away from mine, as if avoiding me would erase the decades of what he'd done. The lawyer began with words that cut like glass. "Your Honor, these are grandparents who only want what's best for their grandson, who has been alienated from them by a mother who made destructive choices as a teenager." My stomach clenched, but I kept my face steady. He painted them as victims, grieving, loving parents who had been denied access to their only grandson. Not once did he mention the year they threw me out, the winter I nearly froze, the times they changed their phone number so I couldn't reach them when I was desperate for help. He glossed over the truth like white paint over rot, But then it was my turn. I laid out everything I had collected. The eviction notice dated January 12, 2000, with my father's signature at the bottom. The social worker's report describing how a 16-year-old girl was turned away from her parents' home while pregnant. My son's school records, showing I was listed as the sole guardian, with not a single signature from them. Medical bills, all paid by me, scraped together from double shifts. Photographs of birthdays, graduations, scraped knees I bandaged, homework I helped with, all without them. Every page I slid forward was a piece of the story they had tried to bury. At one point, the judge leaned back, eyebrows raised, and asked my parents directly, "Why did you cut off your daughter when she was a minor?" My father shifted in his chair, cleared his throat, and muttered something about discipline. My mother sat frozen, lips pursed, eyes fixed on a point beyond the judge's head. There was no remorse, not even now, just stubborn silence and the faint hope that legal words could rewrite history. But history doesn't vanish just because you refuse to look at it. My son stood up when given the chance and spoke with a calm authority that made my throat tighten. "They were never there for me," he said, voice steady. "They never came to a single birthday, never called, never wrote. My mom raised me. She sacrificed everything. If anyone deserves credit for the person I am today, it's her. Not them." The room went quiet, the kind of silence that swallows every sound. And for the first time in my life, I watched my parents flinch at the truth spoken out loud, in front of strangers who could no longer be swayed by their lies. Walking out of that courtroom after the first hearing, the cold air hit my face, and for the first time in 25 years, I felt something close to freedom. Because win or lose, the record had been spoken into existence. The truth had a voice now, and it wasn't just mine anymore. The weeks that followed before the next hearing were some of the longest of my life. Every night I sat at that kitchen table, documents spread out like a paper battlefield, preparing for every possible angle their lawyer might twist. I dug through old boxes stored in the back of closets, unearthing receipts so faded the ink had turned ghost gray, hospital discharge papers from the winter my son had pneumonia, pay stubs from the janitorial job I worked at 16 with notes in the margins, overtime approved. Each scrap was proof that while they looked away, I was there. While they entertained guests in their perfect house, I was scrubbing toilets with swollen ankles, saving enough to buy diapers. My son helped me organize it all into binders. Tabs neatly labeled: medical, education, financial, legal. We became a team, soldier and shield, and with each page we put in order, I felt my fear shrink just a little more. But fear has a way of sneaking back in when the phone rings. One evening, their lawyer called with an offer. "If you agree to shared custody, visitation every other weekend, this can all go away quietly." I stared at the phone, my hands trembling with a rage that felt hotter than anything I'd carried before. Quietly. That was the word they used when they erased me the first time. Quietly, they had closed the door. Quietly, they had told relatives I was gone. Quietly, they had let me rot in the cold while pregnant. I hung up without a word. My parents escalated their tactics. They sent letters to relatives, painting me as unstable, claiming my son was being brainwashed. Old church acquaintances reached out, parroting the same lines. "They're just trying to reconnect. Why won't you let them?" I wanted to scream at every one of them. Where were you when I was 16? Where were you when I begged for help? But I didn't scream. I kept filing evidence, preparing, waiting. The night before the second hearing, my son came into my room and sat on the edge of the bed. He held up a photograph he'd found while sorting papers, me at 17, holding him as a newborn in a thrift store rocking chair, my face gaunt, eyes hollow but locked on him with absolute devotion. He stared at it for a long time before he whispered, "You did this alone. They can't take me now. They don't deserve me." His voice cracked, and for the first time in years, I saw the boy in him again, the one who used to grip my hand so tight it hurt. I pulled him into my arms, and for a moment it was just us, the way it had always been, two against the world. That was when I realized this fight wasn't about custody, not really. It was about erasing the truth versus preserving it. It was about whether the years of struggle, the nights I went hungry so he wouldn't, the hours I spent cleaning until my fingers cracked, whether all of that mattered, or whether they could waltz back in after 25 years and pretend history had never happened. I wasn't just fighting for my son. I was fighting for the girl I used to be, the one they abandoned. So I walked into the courthouse the next morning not as a victim, not as a desperate teenager, but as a woman who had built a life from ashes. And when I saw my parents sitting at that table, still in pearls and pressed suits, still clutching their version of the story, I felt no fear, only resolve. Because this time they couldn't silence me. This time, I had everything they didn't. The truth. The second hearing was where everything began to fracture. The courtroom was packed tighter than before, whispers bouncing off the paneled walls, a few curious faces from our old neighborhood sitting in the benches behind. My parents must have told people to come and support them, because I recognized old church members, even my mother's bridge partner. They all looked at me the way they used to, like the shameful daughter who had ruined her family's image. But I didn't bow my head this time. I sat upright at the defense table with my son beside me, binder after binder stacked neatly in front of us, my hands steady though my heart thundered against my ribs. Their lawyer went first, his voice calm, smooth, trying to soften the story. "These grandparents," he said, "have watched from afar for too long. They only want to repair what has been lost. It is not unusual for youthful mistakes to cause distance, but my clients are here to make amends. Shouldn't this young man have the chance to know his grandparents, to experience the love of family?" He turned toward my son like a performer looking for an audience, but my son's jaw was locked, his eyes burning. When it was our turn, my attorney nodded to me and I stood. My voice shook only at the start, then grew stronger with every word. I laid it bare, how they had thrown me out in January 2000, how a 16-year-old girl with swollen ankles and no money slept in a shelter cot. I produced the eviction notice signed by my father. I showed the medical bills from my son's infancy, everyone addressed to me alone. I described working through nights of nausea, scrubbing toilets in corporate offices while still in high school, holding my belly and whispering to the child inside that I would not fail him. I presented his report cards with my signature, my emergency contacts, my fingerprints across every form, and not a single trace of them anywhere. The courtroom shifted as I spoke. People who had walked in believing my parents' polished narrative began leaning forward, frowning, realizing the story was not so simple. The judge listened, tapping her pen lightly against the desk, her eyes sharp. When I finished, I set down a stack of photographs, 25 years of birthdays, graduations, hospital stays, scraped knees. All with me there. None with them. Then my son stood. His voice carried through the room like iron. They want to call her a bad influence? They want to say she poisoned me against them? She's the reason I'm standing here. She's the reason I'm alive. If they loved me, where were they when I needed shoes for school? Where were they when I was in the hospital with a 104 fever? Where were they when my mom was working 3 jobs to keep us fed? They were absent by choice. That's not love. That's abandonment. His words silenced even the whispers in the back rows. My father shifted in his chair, red climbing up his neck, but he said nothing. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though no tears fell. The judge leaned forward. "I need to be clear," she said, her voice low but firm. "This court is not in the business of rewriting history. I have reviewed the evidence. I have heard the testimony, and what I see is a young man who was raised solely by his mother, without any meaningful involvement from the plaintiffs. That fact cannot be ignored. When the gavel came down that day, it wasn't a final verdict, it was a continuation, the case scheduled for trial. But walking out of that courthouse, I felt taller, because the truth had been spoken aloud, entered into record, no longer just my memory. And in that moment, under the heavy November sky, I realized something. They hadn't just lost me 25 years ago. They had lost him too, and nothing they did now could undo that. By the time the trial date arrived, the weight of 2.5 decades pressed down on every detail of the courtroom. The air itself felt different, thicker, harder to breathe, as though the past had been dragged inside with us, waiting to be dissected under fluorescent lights. The bailiff's voice echoed as he called the case, and I walked in with my son, binders tucked tight against my chest. He looked at me once, just a flicker of reassurance in his eyes, and I felt that old ache of when he was little, when he used to grip my hand so hard at the bus stop. Except now he wasn't the child needing me for protection. He was the man standing with me, a living testament to what I had endured and what I had built. My parents sat across the aisle, their posture rigid, their lawyer shuffling papers with the confidence of someone who thought charisma could mask cruelty. My father looked straight ahead, jaw set, as though sheer stubbornness could keep his lies intact. My mother sat prim, pearls at her throat, her lips pursed as if she were the aggrieved party here, the victim. For a moment, I almost laughed at the performance. 25 years, and still they clung to the story they'd written for themselves, that they had been righteous, that I was reckless, that everything had been my fault. The opening arguments cut deep. Their attorney spoke of reconciliation, family healing, a young man deprived of grandparents' love. He painted me as the gatekeeper, bitter and vengeful, poisoning my son against his bloodline. He even dared to call me an unfit example of forgiveness. Those words nearly made me rise to my feet, but I forced myself still. I had learned long ago, when begging them for food and being turned away, that reacting gave them power. Silence, patience, evidence, those were my weapons now. When it was our turn, my attorney began simply, "This is not a case of reconciliation. This is a case of abandonment. A case of a child cast out at 16, pregnant and alone, by the very people who now claim entitlement." And then he gestured toward me. That was my cue. I stood, my palms sweating but my voice steady. I told the court about the night I was thrown out, the snow outside, my backpack half filled, my father's words like a blade. "We don't raise mistakes." I told them about sleeping in a shelter cot, about begging for diapers at a corner store, about nights cleaning office buildings until my bones ached, while still in high school, just to keep my son alive. One by one, I laid the papers before the judge. The eviction notice with my father's signature, pay stubs from my teenage years, social worker notes detailing how I had been denied entry back into their home, school forms listing me as the sole guardian, medical bills, unpaid balances, all in my name. Photographs of birthdays, of graduations, of scraped knees and broken arms, all with me there, none with them. Each document wasn't just paper. It was proof of survival, proof of love, proof that their absence had been a choice. My parents' lawyer objected, tried to argue irrelevance, but the judge's patience was thinning. "Sit down, counselor," she said firmly at one point, and my father's face flushed red. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, but I noticed, still, no tears. Then my son took the stand. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of our history in his posture. He didn't rush. He spoke carefully, each word like a hammer driving nails into the coffin of their narrative. "They want to call her unfit? She's the reason I'm alive. She's the reason I finished school, got my degree, built my career. Every single memory of support in my life has her in it. They were never there. Not at birthdays. Not at graduations. Not when I was sick. They chose to disappear. And now they want to appear, not because of love, but because of control. And I don't want them in my life." The silence after his testimony was absolute. Even the spectators shifted uncomfortably. I caught the judge watching him with a look that was half stern, half sympathetic. It was the kind of testimony you couldn't fake, the kind that came from scars carved deep into the skin of memory. That day didn't end with a verdict. The process was slower, more grinding, but it ended with a shift. I could feel it in the way people looked at me when we walked out, no longer with pity or judgment, but with the uncomfortable recognition that the truth was not the version they'd been told. And as the heavy courthouse doors closed behind us, my son turned to me and said, "They're losing, Mom. I can see it. They know it too. And for the first time since the phone rang weeks earlier, I let myself believe him. The longer the trial went on, the more their carefully polished story began to splinter under the weight of facts. Their lawyer tried to create sympathy by calling character witnesses, an old neighbor, a distant cousin, people who had only ever seen the version of my family that my parents staged for the world. One woman took the stand and said, "I always saw them as such a loving, stable family. I can't imagine them abandoning their own daughter." Her voice trembled with practiced innocence. I sat there, fists clenched under the table until it was my turn to respond. My attorney handed me a photo. I held it up for the court. Me, at 17, sitting in a thrift store rocking chair, holding my newborn son with hollow cheeks and eyes that looked 20 years older than my age. "If we were such a loving family," I asked the witness directly, "why didn't you see me then? Why didn't you see my parents at my side helping me? Why was I in a shelter cribbing secondhand blankets while they were hosting dinners down the street?" The witness shifted, stammered, and the judge gently reminded her to answer. She couldn't. She admitted she hadn't seen me in those years, only heard stories. That was the beginning of their undoing. Then came the cross-examination of my parents themselves. My father took the stand, his back stiff, his words clipped. He spoke of discipline, of rules, of how he refused to enable bad decisions. He called kicking me out necessary tough love. The judge's brow furrowed as she asked, "Do you believe abandoning a 16-year-old, pregnant and still a minor, constitutes discipline?" My father shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, but he repeated, "She made choices." The same phrase he had always used. As if it were a shield. My mother tried a different tactic, tears that never quite fell, a trembling hand clutching a tissue. She talked about her heartbreak, about how she had prayed every day for me and my son. I wanted to scream, but instead I let the document speak. The judge asked one direct question. "If you prayed for them daily, why are there no records of phone calls, no visits, no letters, no financial assistance, no contact whatsoever for 25 years?" My mother's lips parted, then pressed shut. The tissue crumpled in her hand. She didn't answer. By the third week, I noticed the spectators, those old acquaintances, those neighbors, beginning to shift in their seats, their faces no longer sure of the story they had clung to for decades. Whispers spread during recess, people asking, "Did they really throw her out? Did she really raise him alone?" And in those whispers, I found power. The turning point came when my attorney introduced the binder marked financial. Inside were copies of every hospital bill, every insurance claim, every receipt from when my son was a child. Each one listed my name, never theirs. Then he produced a stack of letters, handwritten notes from my son's teachers over the years, praising my involvement, thanking me for showing up. One note in particular made the courtroom fall silent. "We are grateful for your commitment to your son. We know you are doing this alone, and he is thriving because of your strength." The handwriting was small and neat, the date in the corner, 2005. My son was 10. My parents weren't mentioned once. Their lawyer objected, tried to dismiss it as irrelevant. But the judge leaned forward, her voice cool. "This is highly relevant. It speaks to who raised this child and who did not." That day ended with my parents' lawyer looking rattled, his papers shuffled out of order, his tone sharper than before. My parents left the courtroom quickly, not looking back. And as my son and I walked out into the cold evening air, he turned to me with a smirk I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "They're cracking," he said. "They can't hold it together." For the first time, I allowed myself to smile. Because he was right. Their narrative was breaking apart, piece by piece, under the weight of truth they had tried to bury for 25 years. And soon, there would be no pieces left to hide behind. The final phase of the trial felt less like a legal proceeding and more like the peeling back of rotten wallpaper, layer by layer. The truth no longer hidden, the stench impossible to disguise. Their lawyer tried to recover ground by introducing new claims, that my son had reached out in childhood, that they had been denied a relationship by my stubbornness. But my attorney was ready. He produced phone records, years of calls made to wrong numbers, disconnected lines, all because my parents had changed theirs without leaving a trace. He showed copies of letters returned to sender, envelopes still sealed. Every claim of theirs dissolved the moment documentation was laid beside it. Then came the witnesses they never expected. A former neighbor, now older, who had quietly helped me with diapers once when she found me crying on the steps of our building. She testified how she saw me trudging home late at night from work, belly swollen, parents nowhere in sight. A nurse from the ER who remembered admitting me at 17 with a sick newborn, the look of exhaustion etched into my face, no family by my side. A social worker who recalled making a note in the file, family refuses involvement. Each testimony was another nail. My parents' lawyer objected again and again, but the judge's patience was razor-thin now. "The court will hear this," she snapped. The climax came when my son returned to the stand for redirect. He looked straight at the judge, then at my parents. His voice was low, but every word carried like thunder. "They're trying to rewrite history. But I remember birthdays with no grandparents, Christmas mornings with just my mom, nights when I was sick and she sat awake beside me, holding a cold rag to my forehead. They weren't there. They abandoned her, and by doing that, they abandoned me. And now they want credit, rights, control, after decades of nothing? That's not love. That's entitlement." He paused, then added, "And I want no part of it." Even the spectators behind us, some of whom had come in siding with my parents, were silent, eyes wide, some even shaking their heads. My father gripped the table so hard his knuckles turned white. My mother dabbed her eyes, but it looked more like anger than sorrow. The mask was slipping. When closing arguments began, their lawyer was a shadow of his opening bravado. He leaned on empty phrases, family ties, forgiveness, healing, but they fell flat. My attorney's final words were sharp as glass. "This case isn't about healing. It's about erasure. These plaintiffs abandoned their daughter as a child, pregnant and helpless. They abandoned their grandson from birth until adulthood, and now they seek to erase the truth and rewrite themselves as victims. The evidence, the testimony, the very fabric of 25 years proves otherwise. To grant them anything would not be justice. It would be a lie." When the judge finally spoke, the air in the courtroom went still. She took her time, flipping through pages, her voice calm but unyielding. "This court finds no evidence that the plaintiffs ever acted as guardians, providers, or caretakers in any meaningful way. The testimony presented, supported by extensive documentation, paints a clear and consistent picture of abandonment, not involvement. Custody and visitation are denied. This court affirms the sole guardianship and authority of the respondent, the mother, whose sacrifices are evident not only in paper, but in the character of the son she raised. The gavel struck once. Sharp. Final. My parents froze in their seats, as though waiting for someone to tell them it wasn't real. My father's face turned a mottled red. My mother clutched her pearls like they might anchor her, but no words came. Their lawyer shuffled papers without meeting their eyes, and my son reached for my hand, gripping it the way he once did as a boy, except now it was steady, strong, his way of telling me, "We won. They can't take this from us." Outside the courthouse, the air was cold but crisp, the sky wide open. For the first time in 25 years, I felt the weight slide from my shoulders. They had tried to erase me, to erase him, but in the end, they erased themselves. In the weeks after the verdict, the silence from my parents was deafening. For people who had spent their lives controlling the narrative, their sudden absence from every conversation, every whispered circle of relatives, spoke louder than any words. The church ladies who once whispered about me didn't know what to say now. Some avoided eye contact in the grocery store. Others sent awkward half-sincere notes about praying for healing. I burned most of them in the sink. What healing? There was no wound between us that could close, because it was never mine alone to stitch. They had carved it open and left it raw, and when I scarred over, they came back with a knife. But the real shift was inside my son. For years, I worried he carried quiet doubts, that maybe my side of the story was too harsh, that maybe I'd kept him from something bigger. After the trial, those doubts disappeared. He moved into his own apartment soon after, walls lined with framed photos of the two of us, birthdays, graduations, the time we drove cross-country in a car held together with duct tape. No trace of them. He told me one night, sitting on his couch with a beer in hand, "I used to wonder why I didn't have grandparents like the other kids. Now I know the truth. I wasn't missing anything. I had everything I needed because I had you." I had to excuse myself to the bathroom and cry quietly into a towel. Not tears of grief this time, but release. Meanwhile, the fallout for my parents spread. Word trickled back through relatives that they had been humiliated, that the bridge club, the church, the neighborhood no longer looked at them with the same admiration. They had tried to drag me through the mud, and instead they exposed themselves. My father lost a consulting role at his old company after whispers circulated about the trial. My mother, ever the social climber, found invitations to parties dwindling. They had bet everything on reclaiming control, and instead they lost the last thing they worshipped: reputation. And yet, I felt no triumph. What I felt was a strange, quiet clarity. For 25 years, I had carried the weight of being abandoned. For months during the trial, I carried the fear of losing my son to their lies. But now, standing in my kitchen one evening, the binders packed away into a closet, I realized I was free. Not just legally, not just publicly, but inside. They no longer had power to define me, to rewrite me, to haunt me. My son and I began planning a trip we never thought we'd take, back to that city where I was first thrown out, back to the shelter where I once slept. He wanted to see it, not to dwell on pain, but to witness how far we had come. "It's part of our story," he said, "but it's not who we are anymore." For the first time in decades, I slept through the night without waking in panic. For the first time, I looked at my reflection and didn't see the girl begging at a locked door. I saw the woman who built a home from nothing, who raised a man strong enough to speak the truth even in court. And for the first time, I believed fully what I whispered to myself when he was born. Alone in that rocking chair with hollow eyes and tired arms. You will never be alone. Not as long as I'm breathing. After the verdict, people expected me to gloat, to throw my victory in my parents' faces. But I didn't. What would have been the point? They had already sentenced themselves to a life without us decades ago. The court only made it official. Still, the aftermath was messy. Letters came first, handwritten, shaky cursive from my mother, a single page at a time, always opening with "Dearest daughter." I couldn't finish the first one. The words blurred because they weren't apologies. They were just pleas for access. Pleas for forgiveness without accountability. Your father is sick. Time is short. Your son deserves to know his roots. I tucked them back into the envelopes, unbroken seals, and placed them in a shoebox on the top shelf of the closet. My son didn't even want to read them. "They're strangers to me," he said flatly. And I realized he was right. Blood didn't make them family. Their absence had erased that bond long ago. Then came the phone calls to relatives, the spin campaign, as though losing in court had been some kind of clerical error. My aunt rang one night, her voice strained, urging me to think about reconciliation. I asked her one question. "Where were you the night I was thrown out?" She didn't answer. Silence stretched until I hung up. It was always the same. People wanting me to sacrifice my truth for the sake of appearances. But appearances had already cost me enough. I wasn't sacrificing anymore. Meanwhile, my father tried to salvage his dignity in public. He stopped going to church for a while, then reappeared months later, walking with a cane, head high but eyes shadowed. Whispers followed him down the pews. My mother wore dark glasses even indoors, as if hiding behind them could shield her from the way people looked at her differently now. I knew they were humiliated. And for once, that humiliation wasn't mine to bear. At home, life shifted in small, almost imperceptible ways. My son and I laughed more easily. Meals around the kitchen table weren't heavy with unspoken fears. He invited me to his new apartment, proudly showing me the bookshelf lined with framed pictures, All us, none of them. One photo stood out. Me in my janitor's uniform, holding him in my arms, both of us smiling despite everything. He had placed it front and center. "This is where I come from," he told a friend who visited. Not from them, from me. There were nights, though, when the past still crept in. I'd wake up from dreams where I was 16 again, standing outside that locked door, snow soaking my sneakers, the sound of my father's voice repeating, "We don't raise mistakes." But instead of the panic that used to grip me, I felt a steady, strange strength. Because I knew how the story ended now. It didn't end with me broken on the steps. It ended in a courtroom where truth stood taller than lies. It ended with a grown man declaring that he needed no one but the mother who never left his side. And in that clarity, something softened in me, not toward them, but toward myself. For so long, I had carried shame like an anchor, convinced that being abandoned meant I wasn't enough. But watching my son stand, shoulders squared, voice unshakable, I realized I had been enough all along. More than enough. I had been everything. So when another letter arrived one rainy Thursday, stamped with their return address, I didn't even open it. I walked outside, rain soaking my hair, and dropped it into the garbage bin. Watching the ink blur under the water, I whispered to myself, "No more." It wasn't anger. It was closure. And this time, the silence that followed was mine to keep. In the years since the trial, my life has settled into a rhythm I never thought possible. The binders of evidence sit in the back of a closet, gathering dust, not because I need them anymore, but because they remind me of what I carried and what I overcame. My son has built his own life now, career, friends, a home filled with laughter, and every time I visit him, I see the man he became not because of them, but despite them. He still calls me on Sundays, sometimes just to tell me about a new recipe he's tried or to ask if I remember a childhood story. And every time the phone rings, I feel that same swell of pride I felt the day I first held him in my arms at 17. I still pass by the old streets sometimes, the ones I walked as a scared teenager with a backpack and swollen ankles, praying I'd make it through another night. The houses look smaller now, less intimidating, almost ordinary. Even the church where they paraded their perfect image has lost its power over me. I am no longer the girl desperate to be accepted by people who turned their backs. I am the woman who stood alone, raised a son alone, and proved that family is built on love and presence, not blood and performance. My parents faded into the background after the trial. I hear occasional whispers, illness, arguments, lost friends, but I don't chase the details. I don't need to. Their story doesn't belong to me anymore. They wrote me out once, and now I've written them out in return. And that isn't cruelty, it's survival. It's protection. It's peace. Sometimes late at night, I sit with a cup of tea and think about that 16-year-old version of myself. The girl standing outside in the cold, rejected, humiliated, told she was a mistake. If I could reach back and touch her shoulder, I would tell her, "One day you'll stand in a courtroom with your grown son beside you. One day you'll watch the truth win. One day you'll know you were never the mistake. They were. And now, as I finally close this chapter, I understand the lesson I want to leave behind. People will try to rewrite your story to suit their needs, but the truth has a way of surviving if you have the courage to hold on to it. I don't carry their shame anymore. I don't carry their silence. What I carry now is freedom. What I carry now is pride, so I'll ask you, the women listening to my story, if it had been you in my place, thrown out as a child and then dragged into court decades later, would you have forgiven? Or would you have done exactly what I did?